Greetings, adventurer. Welcome to the Ocean County Library's 5th episode of Forge Your Imagination, a guide to immersive world-building podcast, a series that will point creative individuals in the right direction when attempting to create your own world. I'm your host, Tom, a world-building enthusiast and professional dungeon master with over 13 years of experience. In today's episode, I will be discussing how to create a fictional classification of people and the important details within their groups. Now, without further ado, let's get this quest on a roll. Now, before I begin, I'd like to put a small disclaimer. Please remember, everything I talk about today is purely fictional. They are creations with no connection to any real groups of people. Secondly, I'd like to remind you that the library is an inclusive and diverse environment for all groups of people. Now, let's get back to the topic at hand. Today, I will be discussing the in-depth creation of fictional classifications of people. However, alternatively, you could always use fictional creations that already exist, like those that were written in myths and legends of old. For example, if you wanted your world and its people to have some connection to Norse mythology, you would have access to groups like the dwarves, elves, giants, trolls, and valkyries, and many more. In this case, you could just alter slight details here and there about the group to add your own interesting flavor of change. A good example of this would be like in Dungeons & Dragons. They do that with elves. You have the regular classic elf, you have the astral elf, sea elf, half elf, drow, and eldarin. Now, what makes them so different is where they live and how they adapted to their new lifestyle. For example, an elf who lived by the sea could have learned how to hold their breath for a long period of time. Or maybe, over time, they've managed to develop their own gills that allow them to breathe underwater. Another good example of this would be like how in my universe, Akijan, I reworked how goblins were. Goblins were usually seen in literature to be like crude, evil, cunning, green, ill-mannered, typically gross creatures. And I wasn't really a fan of that narrative, so in my universe, I flipped it around. I made it so that goblins were charismatic, clean, and righteous. They conducted themselves more like knights or paladins. However, sometimes changing minor details like their characteristics isn't enough for a world builder, and for me especially, that was one of those cases. Considering how undervalued and how disliked they usually are, this was the group of people that I decided to completely renovate. I decided to take this one step forward and created 4 different variations, much like how Dungeons & Dragons did with their elves. In my universe of Akijan, I have classic goblins as well as goblin beastkin. These are goblins that like nature and live in the forest, and eventually, because of their closeness with nature in the forest, they develop the ability to transform into an assortment of animals, like bears, deer, wolves, squirrels, and more. Then we have goblin dawnlings. These are goblins who believe in honoring and challenging those with strength. They are the descendants of an ancient, powerful lightning primordial who believed strength meant justice. When I created this variation of goblin, I actually had in mind Byakko, which is one of the 4 symbols of Chinese constellations. Since Byakko looks like a white tiger, this version of goblin has been more bestial in appearance, with sharp teeth, a tail, clawed hands, and scars that litter their bodies. Lastly, we have goblin celestials. These are goblins who have been blessed and have the innate ability to freely control the elements. This special kind of goblin is one that has been infused with the power of the elementals, and because of this, they can control and conjure earth, water, fire, and air at will. That's a few fun variations that I have created based on a group of characters that already existed somewhere else in literature. However, it's highly encouraged to create your own people. I personally feel like there is nothing more exciting than creating a new classification of people from scratch. These are a few things that I would personally have you consider if you want to create an interesting, unique, or exotic new group of people. Okay, adventurer, let's roll initiative and turn our attention to the Ocean County Library's fun program for teens called Dungeons & Dragons for Teens. This is a wonderful experience for young adventurers to get a glimpse at a fantasy world that has already been created by creative and experienced world builders. In this program, players who are ages 13 to 18 can join an adventure in the world of Dungeons & Dragons. This program is open to new and experienced players. However, space is limited, so please be sure to register. This program is available in a few different branches, like the Brick, Lacey, Point Pleasant Beach, and the Toms River Library. You could find the exact dates and times to register online with our calendar of event at theoceancountylibrary.org. Now, adventurers, grab your anvil and hammer, because it's time to return to forging your imagination. Starting at the easiest part of the creation process, we have appearance. You first want to brainstorm and think about the rough draft of your fictional group of people. What do you want them to look like? Should they have feathers, green skin, scales, fur, etc.? The sky's the limit when it comes to the creation of your new group of people. However, if I could give you a word of caution, it would be to remember that you want to build them around their environment. For example, someone who lives in a tundra would have a lot of fur to keep them warm. That would also then allow you to decide what innate abilities and skills they could get. The next we have up is general likes and dislikes of this group of people. Maybe this group is all vegetarians, and they love mushrooms that grow in a very specific cave that they live far away from, so maybe they trade for those goods at a high price. At the same time, since they're vegetarians, maybe that means that they also hate the sight of meat or blood. That means they would also probably love nature and its animals, and dislike hunting and hunters in general. This is a good way of using traits of a group and their environment to help craft their likes and dislikes. I would then dive into the group of people's alignments. For those who are unfamiliar with this term, this describes a group of people's ethical and moral outlook. Typically, it determines if they're naturally seen as good or evil. After that's completed, the alignment can actually be separated into two categories. The first category is what society and other places view them as, which, disclaimer, isn't always accurate. Whereas the second category is what they actually are like. What I mean by this is, if in this fictional world people see angels as good and lawful, then people would naturally trust them. However, that doesn't mean that they're good people. In reality, they could be very different from what the general society thinks of them. They could actually be worse than demons, but that's something you, as the creator, are able to decide. Usually, making a twist of who is good and who is evil is a great way of keeping your audience on their toes. Coming up next, we have languages. If a group of people are known as weretiger, who are furry and feline in appearance, then it might make sense that they're able to speak to other feline animals, like cats, making groups of people unique and able to communicate with creatures that no one else can. It seemingly makes them more useful. The same could be said if someone created a dryad or a nymph that could speak to plants. For those who don't know, a nymph is a creation of Greek mythology whose exterior appearance mimics that of nature. So they could simply have skin that looks or feels like bark, or perhaps their hair is simply made of leaves. Our next topic is common occupations. See, maybe the classifications of people is known for its military prowess because of having renowned strength and honor. Or maybe if they were half spider, for example, maybe they're great at quilting and sewing with their webs. There are countless jobs and professions that could be tailored around the group of people you create. This is based on their beliefs, their morality, their history of their people, their general disposition, or a lot of the times it could just be their special abilities. The last topic I would ask you to be aware of is special abilities. These are abilities that your group of people either developed based on their heritage, history, or environment. What's so fun about this part is that literally anything could happen. For example, if a classification of people were descendants of dragons, then their heritage might have allowed them to breathe fire or grow wings. If I wanted to build upon their history, then maybe their forefathers had messed with the King of Lightning, who had actually cursed their bloodline in vengeance. So in the future, they can never make meaningful connections to people, and anyone that they come in contact with, they actually end up shocking them just from a simple touch. Now that really wraps up everything that I think you should do. However, if you'd like to stick around and listen, I do have a few additional ideas that might help you shatter the expectations of your audience. One such crucial piece of information that I use is what I call the compatibility laws. This will help you keep plot developments from breaking what you designate as canon. This compatibility law would explain if half-breeds are allowed and the general rules of what groups of people aren't compatible to have children. It could also let the audience know if there are any specific groups that come out as only one gender. For example, in Dungeons & Dragons, in my universe, Driders, which are like half human, half spider, Lamias, which are like half snake, half human, and Pixies, which are very similar to fairies, but just more plant-like in nature, they're only able to be born as females. Not to mention, you could also create new groups of people that can only be considered the combination of two others. For example, a Nephilim, which I might have butchered, but bear with me, is usually considered the offspring of a demon and an angel in a lot of games or movies that I've seen. So I put that in. I usually also keep these as secret combinations. I love making combinations like this, and I've created several of them for my own Dungeons & Dragons universe, like I've created Divine Titans, which the players can play as, and it's a combination of a god and a titan. Or Leviathans, which are combinations of a dragon and a triton. Or I even created what I call Lupus Maximus, which is a combination of a werewolf and a kitsune. For those who don't know, a kitsune is almost exactly like a werewolf, but it would be if you could transform into a fox instead of a wolf. I make it so that these all become playable groups of people when a player figures out a combination or shows interest in them. Another additional feature I love to use is magic tiers in Dungeons & Dragons. This also helps me put the occasional drawback on incredibly powerful demi-human children. My typical rule is that the group of people chosen must only include a single magic tier above mortal magic, which mortal magic in my universe is blue. For example, in simpler terms, this means that people like Incubus, who have demon magic, which is red, and Phoenixes, who have red magic, are usually incompatible and are unable to have children together. However, a high elf, who has blue magic, and an Oni, who has red magic, they can produce an offspring. A fun world-building element that I inserted is what happens if a child is miraculously born from two people who shouldn't be able to have children. If somehow a child is born of two groups of people over blue magic, they'll develop a certain incurable sickness that I call arcane overload. This is an illness that affects the raw arcana, otherwise known as raw magic, within their body that they naturally produce. The arcane energies from within produce at such an alarming rate that it can make the person ill and fatigued. This is why the character and or players need to monitor and discharge their magic accordingly, depending on what kind of potence that the magic is. So it'll be in different increments. Like if it's just red magic plus red magic, it'll be like every 24 hours. But if it was something more like red magic and gold magic, that would be every 12 hours. It could be something that is seemingly annoying, but also good for roleplay development, or especially good for writing, of course. This is something that my Dungeons & Dragons players personally love. They use this element for role-playing, and it makes them feel cool. Because if they're red magic, for example, they're able to release a bolt of pure red, arcana-like electricity into the air. Or they could even store it and use it to power up their next spell and give it like a reddish tint of lightning, and it does more damage.
If you are hearing this message, you've officially listened to the entire episode, and for that, I'd like to thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please take a look over some of our other OCL Soundwaves podcasts. Feel free to leave us a rating on Spotify, Radio Public, and Pocket Casts. Most importantly, safe travels, adventurers.
Are you looking for a blast from the past? Don't forget to tune into Wheeler Talk, the history of Ocean County, a podcast brought to you by me, the local history librarian. Episodes of Wheeler Talk are released monthly right here on OCL Soundwaves. Learn about the rich history of Ocean County with topics such as shipwrecks, historic storms, Ocean County's role in the Revolutionary War, tales of local hauntings, and much, much more.